Welcome back. Now, my next guest needs no introduction, but he shall get one. He is among the most principled and courageous writers and thinkers in the world today, with a moral clarity and command of language that is unmatched, as this Al Jazeera journalist found out last week.
It is internationally recognised.
No, it's not. It's not at all.
I want to move on.
That's your view. Hang on, that's your view, and I have to correct your view.
Our views
I have
differ.
to correct. No, it doesn't. The facts, our views might differ, but the facts are the facts, and I want to pick you up on something you just did.
I'm interviewing you.
I know, but
Yes.
I think you're uninformed.
No.
So let me just.
Hardly.
So let me. You are uninformed
Oh,
because
really?
first of all,
Yes.
you didn't say that Egypt is blockading Gaza. Secondly, you claim that Israel.
I'm talking about Israel here, and I want to move.
It's very convenient
from
for
this.
you to mention Israel because you've clearly got an animus here.
Every time there would be a peace agreement, settlements would pop up, and that's why we are where we are today.
No, it's not.
So let's try and move on.
No,
let's try and move on.
It's not at all why we are where we are.
Hang
on.
We're not achieving anything here, so let's try and move on.
No.
Let's try and move on.
No, it's very, because you just did it again. You just threw in another false fact. We are not where we are today because of settlements in the West Bank that are disputed. That's not why Hamas broke out of Gaza on the 7th of October and massacred people in their homes.
As we know,
that's
Hamas
not
got
because of the West
Israeli
Bank, and
support
you well
to take
know
on
it. You well know that.
Douglas Murray, so good to have you back in the studio. Did you not take pity on that woman? I've got to say, she was smug, certainly uninformed, but wow, the way you humbled her, it was...
Well,
even I felt a little bit sorry for her at the end.
no, I mean, you know, you tend to go into an interview like that. It was in South Africa, in Johannesburg. You tend to go in sort of, with goodwill, assuming that the interviewer is hoping to get something interesting out of you and that, they do so. And occasionally you go in and you discover, this person is here to slay a dragon. And the whole thing changes. I did discover afterwards something I wish I'd known before, which was when she said that she had lived in the region. I remember thinking there's something strange about that. And then, of course, it turned out she'd worked for Al Jazeera, which means she'd lived in Doha. And even on a very clear day from Doha, you can't see Gaza, but it was a Palin-esque claim by her.
Yeah, in the region. Yeah, that's the way. Red flags go off. Now, you have arrived in this country and been met with protests. We're normally a welcoming lot, but you've had the usual far-left suspects very much agitated. They've labelled you right-wing, a racist, a supporter of genocide. Let's have a look at some of the chants we're seeing accusing you of supporting genocide.
Gosh.
Douglas Murray, you can't hide, you're supporting genocide. Douglas Murray, you can't hide, you're supporting genocide. Turn the world.
Douglas Murray, you can't hide, you're supporting genocide. What is your response to that very learned criticism?
First of all, I don't feel like I'm hiding, Rita. I mean, it's amazing. This only happened in Sydney, by the way. I did 2 shows at the Enmore Theatre on Sunday. And these protesters showed up, a small group of malcontents showed up on the afternoon. I'm not sure why they didn't do the evening shift. It's possible they didn't know about it. It's possible they slept in, or actually some of them moved on to the port in Sydney where they promptly got arrested. So it was a great day for them. Somebody actually, what was very, very funny, one of them actually sort of tweeted something like, a very important day standing outside the Enmore shouting at Douglas Murray. I was like, that's not a very good day. No. I mean, I think that's a kind of a waste of a day, not least because I could not hear them. It made no difference to me. Thousands of very, very nice, clever, informed, good Sydney residents all paid to come and join me for the day in 2 shows. And they weren't intimidated by these people either. I mean, it's really pathetic. And I never want that to sort of overshadow anything else. I've spoken this past week in Perth, in Adelaide, in Brisbane, and we've had wonderful audiences. And it was the same on Sunday. You always get a few of these people who just scream and shout and think they're going to change the world, but they don't. They don't change my mind. They don't change the audience's mind. In fact, they just annoy audience members. And of course, I mean, this thing about genocide, I mean, it's such a smear and a libel. I mean, there is no genocide in Gaza. I support the efforts of the IDF to get the hostages back. And if these people, by the way, if they I mean, they're such geniuses. They know how to spend their weekends in Sydney hollering. If they're such geniuses, they should really come up with an alternative plan for the IDF to get back the children and women and men who are still in Hamas captivity, and do so with a smaller body count than the one the IDF is currently seeing. And I bet these people don't have that. They think they have all the answers, but they don't.
Well, this is what I don't understand. Just for the optics of it, if nothing else, you would think these anti-Israeli protesters, or pro-Palestinian as they call themselves, would carry just a couple of signs that are anti-Hamas.
Right.
Calling on Hamas to release the hostages, calling on Hamas to surrender, calling on Hamas to stop using the Palestinian people as human shields.
Right.
But you don't see that. And in
No.
fact, in the UK, when I think it was an Iranian man showed up to a protest holding up an anti-Hamas sign, he was physically attacked by the other protesters.
Week after week. Is a very brave young Iranian man, and he has simply gone to several of the protests in London holding up a sign saying Hamas are terrorists, which they are. And that's the British government's policy. Hamas are a prescribed terrorist organisation in the UK. So this brave young Iranian man holding up a sign that says British government policy, he is the one that has repeatedly been attacked by the peaceful protesters at the oh-so-peaceful marches, and it has been the police that have moved him on. I think he's an absolute hero. I love seeing brave people like that standing up. It gives enormous hope to people, and I hope more people do it.
And I think it just shows the lies that we've been told about a lot of these protests, because the fact that he can't peacefully stand there and, in fact, be supported by those people speaks volumes.
That's right.
Now, your tour, yes, in Sydney, you've had some troublemakers. I'm sure in Melbourne you will, because it's the... it's the home of troublemakers. But it sold out your tour so quickly. I'm interested to know what the Australian people who are paying to hear you speak, what are they interested in talking about? What's top of mind for them?
I think it's several things. I mean, obviously, you know, people are very interested about the wider world, about the region, about wars I've covered recently, including the Hamas war, the Ukraine war. But in my as far as I've seen it, we use a thing every night called Slido, so people can send in questions and then upvote the questions they really want you to answer, which is a great system.
Yeah.
And I've noticed that, I mean, there are very, very similar concerns to other countries I've been to recently, and also specific ones to do with Australia. I mean, of course, you had the referendum last year, and the referendum and issues related to it seem to be a sort of bubbling under the surface thing in this country, it seems to me, because there is this, and I've said this a couple of times to audiences here, that the vision of Australians that I grew up with and you grew up with has changed slightly in our own lifetime. In fact, you might say changed quite a lot. And I see that kind of happy country, you know, frank-speaking, clear-thinking sort of Australian tradition sort of being subdued, like it's chased out of people. Like people are made to feel guilty for things they haven't done.
Oh, yes.
They're made to feel like they're usurpers and colonizers and all this sort of thing. And it's so destructive, and you can see it, you can feel it, you can hear it. You know, everybody wants to get along, everyone wants to do well in the future, but, you know, there's no way that this country or any other country can if you're mired in the guilt and this sort of dampening down of the majority, you know, the sort of you can't say that, you can't think that. That's why I love referendums, actually. I mean, they're always an opportunity for the general public to kick our political class in the ghoulies, you know.
And like Brexit, when it came to this referendum, the race-based referendum, it was a case where you had the entire elite, really, the celebrities, the activists, the corporates, all of them, sporting clubs, all on the side of the yes vote, which obviously the Australian government was backing. And then the no vote wins in every single state.
Yes.
And that tells you plenty, even in left-leaning states like here in Victoria. But I think we do have this unique problem in Australia, and I think it's particularly bad here, more so than the US and the UK, where there is this self-loathing. We can't even celebrate our national day, Australia Day, without being accused of supporting genocide and white supremacy, and it's an invasion and it's a harmful day. You don't even have that in the UK or the US, where UK, they still revere their traditions. US, there's a great deal of patriotism across much of the country. But I just wonder what the impact is on a country that seems determined to hate itself.
Yeah, I mean, the long-term impact, we don't yet know. I mean, we can guess. We don't yet know because, as far as I know, no civilization has tried this before. Yeah. You know, most people sort of want to exist, want to thrive, you know, and most people are proud of what has gone well in their country. You know, every country's had things that they're not proud of.
Of course.
But the question isn't that, and isn't lingering all the time on that. The question is, what have we done well? You know, you saw this in Don Lemon's interview with Elon Musk last week, where Elon Musk just said, you know, if we keep talking about the slave trade in America, we're never going to get past it. And Don Lemon seems sort of thrown by that, as he is by any original thought. But he seemed genuinely thrown by that. But it's absolutely true. The question isn't whether or not you've acknowledged any mistakes in your past. The point is, are we able to get past them? And are we able to say anything good about ourselves? And if in Australia, the whole narrative is just, as you say, genocide yesterday, genocide today, genocide tomorrow, of course people aren't going to be brought up to be proud of their country. And of course they aren't going to see the good things. I would just beg the people who fall into that narrative, which includes a lot of young people who go along with the herd. A lot of young people don't, but a lot of young people do go along with that herd. I would beg them just to go somewhere else in the world, just for a week, and see the comparative rights that you have in any other country in this region and the rights you have here, the traditions in any other region, the traditions you have here, what's gone well in other parts of the region and what's gone well here. And, you know, to revive something I've said to you before in other contexts, there's a reason that the boats come to Australia and they do not leave from Australia to other places. There is a reason. And if the people who do this, there's nothing good about Australia, we're all genocidists and murderers and so on, which is absolutely preposterous. And nobody's guilty of things they didn't do. But if those people could just reflect for a moment, you know, why is it that if this country is as bad as these people and the corporations and all these pop stars and so on, if it's as bad as they say, why are people not fleeing Melbourne today? Why is this city booming? Why are people not fleeing here for the sanctuary of communist China? There must be something we've done well. There must be something you've done well in Australia. I think there's a lot you've done well.
The only place Victorians are fleeing is Queensland, to be much further than down. But this notion of we're on stolen land, that seems to be
preposterous.
A grievance, and you know, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. You've flown around the country. I'm sure you've heard, as soon as a plane lands, this acknowledgement of country. Yes. There's almost this notion that we are on interlopers on someone else's land, and we're not as entitled to feel that it's as much ours as it is theirs.
Which means you have a population where the majority feels less than. Now, I mean, that if you had a minority population, say 3% of the population, that was repeatedly made to feel less than the rest, I think we would say, look, that's ridiculous. That 3% of the population should be encouraged, should be made to feel welcome, should be made to feel at home. We don't hold them back, anything else. It would be madness to hold back 3% of your population. When you're dealing with the majority of your population being made to feel less than, I mean, as I say, that's an experiment no one has really tried before. No. People have tried to oppress minorities, but trying to oppress and beleaguer and demoralise the majority in a country, I mean, that's lunacy.
It is, and that's what really the referendum was about. It wasn't about equal rights. It was about giving a particular minority additional rights. Yeah. And that's where people said no.
Yeah, we're either equal or we're not.
That's it.
You know?
Absolutely. Now, you've been warning us about some of these issues for years now in your books, what's happening in the West, the threats against Western civilization. What do you see right now in 2024 as the biggest threat facing the West?
I think it's that one. I think it's within, Rita. I really do. I think it's the threat within of us delegitimising ourselves. It's the threat in America of people being, you know, I've said this a bit to audiences this week. If you look at the polls that came out when Ukraine was invaded, in America asking Americans whether or not they would fight for their country if it was invaded. Only just a majority of Americans said they would. A minority of Democrats, a slight majority of Republicans. And it was the same recently in the UK when the defense minister said, look, if Russia does roll into the Baltics, we might have to have conscription. A minority of young Brits said they would be willing to fight for their country. But here's the thing. I understand that. I abhor it. I'm very, very sorry that it's the case. But I understand it, because if you've been told your country was rotten from the start, as with Australia, entirely based on theft and colonialism and repression and racism and much more, as if the rest of the world was based on just kumbaya. If you believe that, why the hell would you lay down your life for it? If you were told from kindergarten onwards that you were on stolen land, that you were a usurper, that you'd enslaved people when you'd done nothing other than, try to build some bricks or something, why would you risk your life or lay down your life for a country you were told was rotten? And the answer is, it would be madness to do so. We are telling ourselves a totally false version of our history, and at the very least an unfair version of our history. And it's the same in Australia, it's the same in Britain, same in America. And, there's a very odd thing that happens when that occurs, which is that every opportunistic thing comes in. People come in and they claim you've done things that you've never heard of, and you say, well, probably that as well, because I'm guilty of everything else.
Exactly.
And before you know it, you're just accepting versions of yourself that are not just false but are destructive. And I think that's the biggest one. But the good news is, that's one we can solve. That's one we can solve.
How do we solve it? Is it through the education system, the curriculum? How do we actually address this teaching that we've had really now for decades, that we are inherently oppressors and evil, and the success of the West is built on colonisation and the backs of oppressed people?
Well, I mean, the first thing is, no change like this can be done by government edict. We can't wait for the Minister of Culture to announce a new inquiry, followed by a consultative process and then an interim report. That is not going to solve any of this. I believe it's in all of our hands. It's in the hands of everybody who voted in the referendum and the ones who didn't. It's in the hands of everybody who wishes to have a better life here in Australia, here in the West. It's in our hands to say no when this narrative is pushed on us, in whatever way you can. I've spoken this week to people from a bewildering variety of professions who've come to my events, and they very often have a story from the workplace of, this was being said, I didn't know what to do, or I did know what to do, and I did say something. I would say if everybody just took one step forward, that would solve an enormous amount of things. Just one step forward to say no, not to be pushed around. I never saw Australians as a people, any more than I did my fellow Brits. I never saw us as people who could be easily pushed around. Actually, quite the opposite. I don't believe people want to live as sort of subjugated, scolded people. And if you want to get anywhere in your life, as an individual or as a society, you've got to encourage not this endless repression and this endless scolding. You've got to encourage heroism. You've got to encourage entrepreneurialism. You've got to encourage daring. The remarkable people that this country has produced were remarkable not because they were quiescent and shy and didn't want to make any noise in the world. They were remarkable because they wanted to get out there.
Yes.
That's what made this country. That's what made Britain. That's what made America. And that's what will make us tomorrow. And we should look to that, because all of our competitors and rivals on the world stage, they have their young being educated very hard, indeed working many times as hard as some kids do here, to get the lifestyle that we're used to and thinks our God-given right. And it isn't. It's only our God-given right if we fight for it.
Absolutely. But we have seen in other parts of the world, Europe, the rise of the right, or the far right, if you believe the media. We've seen that from Italy to the Netherlands, South America, Central America, El Salvador and Argentina. What do you think is behind that? Is just that politics going backwards and forwards, or is that a movement that you think there's something behind that?
I'm always wary about drawing out too big an extrapolation of the sort of left-right global shifts, because, for instance, I mean, we've got elections this year, I'm sure you've noticed, in America and in Britain. You've heard tell of that. Yes. And also in Britain. And in Britain, it shows very likely that we'll have a left-wing Labour government in Britain by the end of this year. And
arguably, you've had one for some years.
Well, I think we've had one for 14 years, but yeah, that's but so the interesting thing is that Britain might be heading to the left. Which I think will be a disaster for Britain on the economy and much else, but the Conservatives deserve a drubbing. And in America, who knows? Maybe it's Joe Biden, maybe it's Donald Trump. If it's Joe Biden again, then yes. I mean, a lot of countries have been shifting to the right, and quite a long way to the right in some cases. But if countries like Britain and America shift to the left, you can't say that it's a pattern that is everywhere. Absolutely. I would like to think that it's possible for voters, though, to show how they actually feel. There's a strong feeling in a lot of countries of just disengagement. Voters saying, I don't have anyone to vote for. It's all a waste of time. I'd like to think that whenever people say this party is beyond the pale, that party is beyond the pale, I say, look, the democratic process includes people you don't like. But the most important thing is, do people feel they have a stake in it? And that includes the stake, as I say, to kick hard at the people who've been telling you what you should do, what you should think, and who you should be.
Absolutely. Now, there has been this political realignment we've seen in the UK, US, in Australia as well, where you've got the affluent leaning increasingly left, whilst the working class, middle class are switching to the conservative side. It explains a lot of the support that Trump receives. Why do you think that is? Why do you think there's been almost this quite stark political realignment? Yeah,
this is what I think it's partly attributable to what Rob Henderson, the American writer, calls the luxury beliefs class. Luxury beliefs. The people you're talking about, the sort of, the elites in a lot of the media. I mean, there's lots of elites always, and there's no bad thing. But I mean, the specific thing of having an elite of anti-elitists, having an elite that believes that they know best and the public are the problem. To use the old joke of Brecht, the public are the problem, we need to find a new public. But the people, like the ones we were talking about earlier, and the corporations and the big media and entertainment stars who came out for the losing side on the referendum, a lot of those people are just signalling something. They're just saying, I'm on the right side. And of course, I think what a lot of people in the electorate have cottoned on to is that a lot of these people who lecture us and berate us from the stage of the Oscars to Parliament here, a lot of them are saying things that they think make them look good, but are actually bad for the country. Like, my friend Lionel Shriver pointed this out some time ago about the thing of, self-hating. And she said to me, Douglas, these people you're talking about who are pushing self-hatred on us, they don't hate themselves at all. They love themselves. They love themselves. And making other people feel self-hatred and pretending they do, pretending they're so guilt-ridden, millions of ribbons down each side of their jackets, those people feel fantastic about themselves. And making us feel guilty is just part of that.
It's part of the act. Now, to current events, we saw that horrific Islamist attack in Russia, saw 137 people gunned down, including 3 children. Another 182 people were injured. The death toll there was horrific. Since then, we've seen the capture of the 4 suspects and the torture they've been subjected to by Russian forces, with one having an ear cut off and fed to him, another having electric shocks given to his genital area. I mean, the brutality is horrific as well. And Douglas, I know this is going to be a unpopular opinion, but perhaps I wouldn't be saying this if it was my family member who'd been murdered, but this disturbs me greatly, and the reaction to it disturbs me greatly. There seems to be really not much condemnation of this torture. Is torture ever justified?
No, I don't think it is. But I think that what you see is just the operation tendencies of the FSB. This is how the Russians operate. But again, it's one of the things that people should remember when they're forever castigating the West. You know, everyone's always, you know, all these people who go around saying, you know, war crimes about the Israelis, genocide, war crimes in America, torture, and all this sort of thing. This is a country, Russia, which actually does do that and actually does believe in it.
And proudly, on camera.
Exactly.
There's video footage of all this.
Exactly. And they're not going to bow to... I mean, you know, maybe a mob can get together, or a protest group later in Melbourne about this. But I doubt it will, you know, because the Russians don't listen. They don't listen at all.
What about the reaction? Because from otherwise decent people, they seem to have no issue with this. And I know we're talking about monsters. I know we're talking about men who gunned down over 100 people, including 3 children, but the justification for torture, that worries me. That worries me about where we are.
Well, I think, look, I think that, look, I mean, these terrorists, obviously, you know, the lowest of the low life. So, I mean, to do that, to go into a shopping centre and a theatre and start gunning people down, we've seen it elsewhere. We've seen it in London. We've seen it in Paris. You know, we've seen it sadly around the world. And it's inevitable that there is rage in people's hearts about this. And there's even more rage in the West because our governments tell us we shouldn't be allowed to feel rage.
No, we can't even condemn it. We had the Manchester bombing and there was almost an immediate drive against Islamophobia.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always the same, always the same. But you know, the thing is, there is... When somebody does something, when a group of people do something like ISIS appear to have done in Moscow, of course, there's a sort of feeling of vengefulness and revenge. Now, in the West, we would hope that we would prosecute that revenge as carefully as possible, and that it would be legal, that it would go through the law courts if the people are captured alive. But in other theatres, they'd be killed in operation and during the attack and else, you know, other things. It's just that, you know, that is an inevitable tendency to want to have revenge after that. But, I mean, the fact that in Russia that revenge extends to torture, as I say, is not at all a surprise in Russia. But you know, I mean, I think you can want there to be no pity for the terrorists without encouraging them to be mutilated by the Russian troops. I mean, it's just...
Now, before you go, I've got to ask you about the US. We're seeing the political prosecution of Donald Trump. They've been trying to take his assets. Today, there's been a development there with the bond being reduced dramatically, and he's saying that he'll be posting that new amount. I think it's 175 million US. How do you see this effort to get Trump before he can be re-elected? It seems to be a determined effort from the Democrats and their lawmakers to politicise the justice system. And it really has a dangerous effect. You look at some of the polling now, trust in the US justice system is at record lows. People do not trust the system.
Well, it's a very interesting thing, that because, of course, a lot of Americans didn't trust the justice system already. I mean, the conviction rates in the US courts, for anyone who's been through them, are astronomically high.
Almost Beijing-like, but not quite.
Yeah, I mean, it's teetering on 99%, you know, and so a lot of Americans who've had experience of that already distrusted it. Then you've had the sort of super politicization of things like the Supreme Court, and then the Trump persecution. I do think it's a kind of persecution. I have plenty of criticisms of Donald Trump, but if you wanted to make sure he wasn't elected again, then run a really good candidate against him and highlight the things that he did in his term of office that you disagree with. Most people, I think, in America can see that this is a form of endless persecution against Trump. It certainly looks like that. This way of sort of trying to ruin him financially just looks like the final sort of, you know, the final turn of that dial. And I think a lot of people will see it as being cruel and unusual. I think it's only helping Trump, though. You know, I mean, as you say, I'm not sure that outside America people are quite prepared for this. You know, the polls that you've seen, that I've seen, that say that he's likely to win against Biden later this year. I mean, personally, you know, I have just about enough existential energy to, you know, cover various wars and things. I'm not sure if I have the existential energy this time, Rita, to cover Trump-Biden Part 2. We last met in America, in New York, in Trump-Biden round 1. I don't know. I mean, those guys might be there for round 2. You might be there for round 2. I think I might be just propping up the bar, exhausted by that. I'm not sure. This is going to be brutal, Rita.
Oh, it is absolutely going to be brutal. But we've seen the Biden administration reverse course on Israel, and a lot of the conjecture there is, well, it's because they're trying to hold on to those swing seats, Michigan, Minnesota, where there's large Muslim populations who are very upset with the Democrats for standing with Israel. How do you see that? How is the Biden administration going to balance that, that supporting their ally, but also making sure they don't lose those crucial swing seats?
There's a very interesting thing that's gone on in the last few days, which people haven't noted, which is whilst the rhetoric has ramped up against Israel from the Biden administration, there's been a new package of arms for Israel from the administration. Now, that's very interesting. I'm very pleased that that's the case, because I think Israel should be allowed to win its war against Hamas and destroy Hamas. But it's very interesting that they're doing this two-hander, effectively. The sort of public statements and then what they're actually doing. I mean, you know, David Cameron, Lord Cameron to us, he's just said that, you know, if Israel doesn't do what Lord Cameron wants, then he might stop arms shipments to Israel from Britain. Britain doesn't make a significant amount of arms anyway, so I mean, it's a sort of rather grandstanding thing to do. But it is interesting, that difference between the rhetoric and the reality from Biden. I would just say, you know, the Biden administration has been a pretty good friend to Israel during this, but they are worried, it seems, about their polling in Minnesota and so on. I understand it. I would just say that, you know, I mean, Rita, if Australia was at war, and or no, let's put it the other way around. Let's say if America was at war, and it wasn't going down all that well among some people in Australia, I would not expect the Australian Prime Minister to pick up the phone to the President and say, now, look, you've got to halt your war because some of our voters in Melbourne are displeased with it.
Yeah, exactly.
You wouldn't expect that from an ally. I mean, the job of an ally is to be supportive to you in your hour of need. And God knows it's an hour of need in Israel. And I would hope that America would stand by Israel as it finishes its war against the terrorists, as I would expect people to stand by this country if this country suffered a similar outrage to that which Israel suffered on the 7th.
Douglas Murray, always a pleasure. Thank you for your time this evening.
Terrific to see you in person.